The woman who slapped me had no idea the photograph on my kitchen wall held the truth she had spent her whole life defending. She stood over me in the marble foyer as if the house were a courtroom and I the defendant. Her pearl necklace bobbed with each word. Her voice was calm until it wasn't. Then it snapped. "Why is my wife's face on your wall?" she asked, and the question landed like a physical blow. Her hand moved before the words finished. The slap stung less than the realization that she thought she owned the right to decide what belonged to me, to decide whose images I could keep. For a second, I tasted metal. I touched my cheek as if it might be broken. Around us, the staff had stopped moving. The chandeliers seemed to dim. And James, my employer, my complicating truth, was somewhere to the side, his jaw tightening into a line I would later understand as the first fracture of his old life. This moment, the slap, the accusation, the bright, violent flash of her ring, would be the hinge on which everything turned. She was Danielle Alden, the wife who had walked into a marriage with a man who would never forget the woman he used to call Maria. From that night on, Danielle would perform hatred with an expertise born of privilege, precise, cold, unapologetic. She would make my life small in 100 invisible ways: a misplaced paste-up, a curt dismissal, a rumor whispered at a lunch she hosted. But tonight she made it loud enough for everyone to hear. I had the photograph folded in my coat pocket. I should have left it at home. I had promised myself I would. Instead, I had tucked it where only I would find it, like a talisman, then carried it into the house where everything might have been different if someone had told the truth sooner. When the door shut behind Danielle's retreating heels, the staff breathed as if rescued. James stood there looking like a man who had been shown a mirror he had been avoiding. He was quiet, the kind of quiet that held years of taste and regret. He reached for my hand as if to apologize, but instead he asked me, quietly, "Show me." We stood in the servants' kitchen, an ugly, practical room behind the Danish oak doors, while I unfolded a photograph that had been my mother's blessing and my chain. The picture had been taken at a gala decades earlier. A woman in a silver gown, laugh caught mid-tilt, looked out of the frame with a face I had stared at as long as I could remember. The woman everyone called Maria at the parties, the woman who had been the subject of polite conversation in rooms where I never belonged. James's fingers brushed the edge of the photo. His eyes moved across it like someone reading an old map. For a moment I thought he would hand it back and tell me it had been a mistake, a resemblance, a cruel coincidence. Instead, his shoulders dropped as if someone had finally set down a weight he had been carrying without naming. "Amara," he said, and the name made the room colder.
We called her Amara at home. My mother had never spoken that name in front of me. She never taught me the story of the face in the photograph. She never used the names of those who had broken her. She taught me instead how to dry dishes so no one knew I existed, and how to press a uniform until the seams looked like they had been born neat. She had 2 names, I whispered. She, my mother, called herself Amara in the mornings. In everything else, she was Maria. James's breath hitched. He turned the photo over. Written in a hand that trembled with memory, on the back of the glossy image were words that cut into him like a pen into flesh. "For what it's worth, in another life." He had been a young man then, with a laugh that slid through rooms and made people feel important. I had heard the stories, devotional, half-romantic stories, told by housekeepers and bartenders, the way people who live on the periphery keep memories like contraband. He had loved a woman who became 2 things for different audiences, a name whispered in the dark and a name that shone on invitation lists. That she had raised me and kept me in the fold of her silence was a fact I had moved through my life carrying like an old coat. "Why didn't you tell me?" James asked, and it wasn't aimed at me, it was aimed at himself. I did not have an answer that would make the years undo themselves. I had been 20 when she died, and adult enough to know how to keep from saying things that when they could make easier, if telling would make it mean a fight she wasn't equipped to fight. People with power have a way of rewriting the world around them so the least visible among us vanish backward like fog. My mother wanted me safe. She wanted me to survive. And survival, she decided, looked like silence. That night, after the staff had shuffled away and the lamps were dim, James shut the back door and told me, "Tell me everything you remember." I told him about the small blue bracelet I had worn as a child, its paint chipped away from teeth and time. I told him about the name she whispered when she thought no one was listening. I told him about the way her knuckles went white when the phone rang late, how she would fold herself into the sink for a breath only after the house had cooled. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he sat in silence, the kind that holds evidence. "You deserve to know," he said finally, "and I deserve to know who she loved. If there is any truth in what you say, if Amara was Maria, the rest follows." It was then he used the word that would reframe my entire life: daughter. Not in law, not yet. Not with signatures, birth certificates, or the slow, stubborn patience of courts, but in a way that carried the weight and acknowledgement. He put the photograph back into my hand and said, "Come to the house tonight. No one else."
That admission, raw, imperfect, spoken in a kitchen where the tiles held no gravity, made Danielle's later hatred not only personal, but symbolic. She would not only resent me, she would come to see me as an intrusion into a life she had bought, and perhaps not even bought with money, but with her certainty. When James first spoke the word daughter to me, he had not yet considered her. He had only thought of the woman who had been, and the daughter who had lived in corners. I went home that night to my tiny apartment on the 3rd floor above a laundromat. The smell of detergent rose like a benediction. I had lived in that small space since the funeral. A bed, a table, a shelf where my mother's few possessions waited like witnesses. The photograph slid into a drawer with the care of something sacred and dangerous. In the dark, I took out a thin envelope I had found months after the funeral, stuck at the back of a recipe book she had kept between pages of an old hymnal. It was addressed to no one and everyone in handwriting that matched the slow, deliberate letters on the back of the photo. Inside was a letter that began, "If you ever read this, forgive me for not telling you sooner." Her voice on the page was the one I had kept, neither bitter nor pleading, but tired. She wrote of a life that had been split by choices and shame, of names given to fit into rooms, and names kept for the small tragedy she would not give away. And in the last paragraph, written like a prayer or a dare, she had written a name I had never known belonged to me. The single word that made me tilt the envelope as if hearing it aloud could change the color of the paper. Ella. I had been named by a woman who had known too well the luxury of keeping a child small so that the world wouldn't take notice. My mother had chosen a name for me that wasn't her own, maybe to keep us unlinked in case her life required erasure, or maybe because the name Maria was a garment she wore in public, and not a thing to be shared in the blink between husband and housekeeper. The letter told me what little she could, that there had been another life, that the man who had been warm and present in fragments had once loved her, that there had been promises whispered in hotel lobbies, and names that slid between teeth like a secret. Beneath her last line, beneath the apology and the request that I live fully, was a small key taped to the paper. It was thin and rusted, the type that fits a locker or a safety deposit, not the polished key to a car or a door, but a holder of things meant to be kept away. Locker 237, she had written under the key in a hand young enough to reveal hope. If anything happens, go to locker 237. If you find me gone, know that I did this to keep you. I sat with that key for a long time. Outside, the laundromat hummed a monotonous rhythm. Upstairs, a neighbor argued on the phone in a language I had learned to understand only by its cadence.
Inside, the apartment smelled of lemon oil and the faint ghost of her perfume. The key was heavier than it looked, as if it carried the rust of decades in its teeth. I could have left it alone. I could have let the pages curl and the brass melt into the drawer where grief is sometimes politely kept. But the key was an invitation, the kind you accept with the naivety of someone who has nothing left to lose. The first small CTA, then, feels like direction from a friend in a dark room. If this grabbed you, stay with me through this. There is more to come, and I promise you, this is only the beginning of what the photograph, the key, and the name would pull loose. The next morning, I went back to the house. James had agreed, in a way that surprised me, to accompany me. He said it felt like the right thing to do, though his hand still trembled when he reached for a mug. He moved differently around me now, less the man who walked past rooms without seeing the people who cleaned them, and more a person rediscovering shadows he had once cast. We drove to a facility on the outskirts of town, where the lockers were housed in a neat row, anonymous doors waiting in metal silence. The man at the counter asked a few questions, flicked through a ledger, found the page that listed 237, and handed me a claim slip with a bureaucratic boredom that made everything feel like a legal drama rather than a personal excavation. The key fit the lock with a reluctant clunk. Inside the locker there were boxes, brown, taped, labeled in my mother's careful hand. There were photographs stacked like cards in a child's game, images of my mother at different ages, with different smiles, sometimes alone and sometimes leaning into someone whose face I couldn't make out in the low light. There was a small embroidered dress, yellowed at the seams, a child's shoe with the name Amara faintly stitched into the tongue. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope with no postage and no address, just my mother's handwriting again, and a line I had not noticed before, for James, if he ever looks me up. My hands moved before my head could catch up. I brought the envelope to the light, peeled the flap, and unfolded the letter that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had the softness of memory. It took my breath. The letter was full of small, polite apologies, and then a direct admission that stunned me with its simplicity, the name of my father, the confession that she had named me for the wrong reasons, and an acknowledgement that she had left things unspoken to protect us both. If the letter had a sound, it would have been a sudden intake, the kind that follows when you learn that the world you've built on a mission rests on a hinge you were never shown. James read it over my shoulder. His skin went pale in a way that had nothing to do with linen. He whispered a name I had never heard him speak, as if saying it aloud might summon a ghost.
The room felt smaller then, full of the artifacts of a life that had been partitioned into public and private, neat as an edited film. "You should take that home," he said. "You should keep this with you." I could have left then. The practical step was to walk away with photo and letter and child's shoe and try to reconstitute the meaning of my name in a life that had not been designed for me. But information, once held, becomes a responsibility. Possession of the truth meant posing it to people who could act on it. It meant naming abusers in whole rooms and risking people who preferred to live in soft lies. When I told James we needed help, real legal help, someone who could subpoena records and coach answers from institutions that did not like to be opened, he nodded. The man who had moved through the world in a custom-made suit now seemed to understand there were things money could not reseal. He called a man named Marcus, a private investigator with a way of asking questions, like a blade of grass asking light for permission. Marcus arrived with a tired face and a notebook that lived in the crease of his palm. He walked through the boxes with a sort of practical reverence, pausing on paperwork, on the edge of a hospital band that read Amara L. He noted names, dates, the small clerical errors that become evidence exactly because they are small. He asked where I had been born. He asked if anyone had ever told me about nurses or a midwife. He asked the kinds of questions I had made myself not ask. "You have to be ready for what this opens," he said, and his voice made me feel as if I had stepped onto frozen water. "Once you start pulling threads, you can't predict what unravels." We pulled threads. We began with the church bulletins tucked in one of the boxes, purple headlines printed in a time when my mother's life had been a secret publicly as well as privately. There were references to charity drives and mentions of a Maria Alden who had hosted tea for widows. We found a postcard that bore the return address of a beachfront hotel, postmarked the same year as the photograph from the gala. In an envelope, a receipt showed James had sent money under a name that matched the one in the letter. The receipts had been filed away, polite and legal, as if financial transactions could bury the weight of human affairs. The more we found, the more clear one thing became. My mother's life had been carved into two rooms, one where her face could be celebrated and therefore owned, and another where her daughter could be kept small enough to be ignored. When Marcus suggested a DNA test to remove the possibility that it was all coincidence, I nodded before I had time to think of the consequences. DNA is a fact in a world of rumor. It is a blunt instrument that can trim away the fog. We arranged a test through a clinic with a name like Comfort. The kit looked almost comical in its clinical whiteness. Swabs, a return envelope stamped confidential.
I tried to laugh. When I swabbed the inside of my cheek, the act felt intimate and ridiculous, an echo of childhood games transmuted into proof. "These results will not be the end of the story," Marcus said. "If they match, it only makes the next part louder." James drove me home that day. The car smelled faintly of cologne and old money. He spoke haltingly, as if each sentence might unmake a polished life he had carefully arranged. He said he had been ashamed, that he wished he had done things differently, and then he said the words no one had said at my mother's funeral. I should have known. Later, in the quiet between washing dishes and ironing, I began to receive notes. Thin, menacingly polite messages slipped under my door at night. Someone was watching too closely. A photograph of the wardrobe I owned had been left taped to my mailbox, as if to remind me how visible my small life had become and how owning truth invited danger. Jacob Green, my mother's brother, the man who had been both uncle and something uglier in the shadows, felt the shift in the air before anyone else. He appeared at my door one evening with hands like a man who still smelled of the bar where he had learned his gruffness. He called me by the name my mother used for me when she was nervous, and when I said his name back, he smiled thinly and said, "You'll be careful now, won't you, Ella? Some things are better off sleeping." Threats were a part of the fabric of my life. You keep certain things hidden because the forces that will try to keep them hidden know how to exploit fear. A threat nodded toward violence without naming it. It suggested that revealing the truth could cost more than you were ready to give. For many people, the choice to speak is staggered by fear. For some, it is the only path left. Marcus advised, calmly, clinically, that we document everything, keep a log, file for restraining orders if necessary. He suggested we involve authorities and keep evidence off our phones where it might be hacked. Every procedural recommendation felt like a bandage and a spotlight at once. The more we protected ourselves, the more visible the protection became. There was a moment in the middle of this gathering storm when I realized the slaps and the whispers and the small humiliations were not only Danielle's doing. They were the acts of a whole ecosystem that had learned to prefer silence. Danielle's hatred had texture. It was not only personal jealousy. It was an inherited certainty that the world belonged to people like her, and you had better know your place if you were not one of them. Still, hatred needs a target. I had become that target when I started holding a photograph like a lighthouse. The photograph changed me from a background presence to a possible claimant. Danielle's face hardened because I forced a story back into a room she had wanted to keep neat.
One afternoon, Marcus called and said a name had turned up in an old ledger. A Grant Mitchell, a consultant who'd done favors, arranged files, and smoothed bad headlines with a wink. Grant's name was a thread that connected James's world to the administrative machinery that could disappear records. Marcus's tone indicated this was the sort of man who knew how to keep certain letters folded away. When I asked James why he had never looked for me, his answer was a museum of excuses that crumbled as he opened his mouth. He had been young, he said. He had been terrified of scandal. He had been afraid of bringing shame on a woman he loved. He had been convenient before he had been courageous. The truth is uglier than simple cowardice. It is the way people clothe themselves in rationalizations until the weight of what they deny becomes the shape of their future. Nevertheless, there was a shift. He began to sign checks differently. He opened a line of communication with an attorney he said he trusted. He sat at my kitchen table one night with a folder labeled with his assistant's neat handwriting and told me we could take legal steps to subpoena records. The idea seemed improbable and vital all at once. It was proof that his wealth could be used to pry open doors that had been sealed, though even he admitted wealth does not always pry the heart open. That admission, his willingness to let his name be connected, was the bridge that would make Danielle's hate not just a snub at a staffer, but a wound in a household. If he chose to acknowledge the existence of a child in secret, then he was also choosing to alter the narrative of his marriage. People like Danielle measure threats not only by their truth, but by the inconvenience they pose. When truth becomes inconvenient to a life arranged by convenience, the reaction is often fury. We began to file the soft traces of proof into something that looked like an argument: photographs, receipts, the letter, the key, and the boxes from locker 237. We took copies and hid them in places that were not supposed to exist: an off-site storage file, a lawyer's digital vault, the quiet space inside Marcus's case. We moved with the caution of people excavating a grave that others had been keeping watch over. At night, I would wake with a question clinging to my throat. If James could admit to my mother's name in a kitchen, could he also say the word daughter at a family dinner? Would he be willing to shift the foundation of everything he had built? Would he be willing to risk his standing for a person who had been invisible for so long? Danielle, of course, did not wait politely to be invited to feel threatened. She leaned into her certainty like armor. The night of the fundraiser, when she slapped me, she had, in private, already been aligning the narrative: that I was a liar, that the photograph was a forgery, that people like me were opportunists.
She had allies in subtle ways, old money networks that whisper and steady each other's hands. A single whisper can make a whole social room stiff with suspicion. Not everyone sided with her. Some staff who had been around the block told me stories in private, of small favors my mother had done, of the way she had baked cakes for nurses, of the way she had left envelopes for the poor at the church. The people who saw my mother as fully human saw me too, but the loudest voices at the table were the ones with polished silver spoons. When we first talked to an assistant named George about finding old guest lists and receipts, he hesitated, as if remembering the right thing might get him fired. Roland, a driver with a face like an old map, brought us the first of many odd favors: an envelope he had found lodged under the seat of a car, a receipt for a deposit in a name that wasn't Maria, but matched the man in the letter. Each small thing pulled us nearer to a shape: that my mother had been loved in ways that were kept secret, that her life had crossed with James's several times, and that the system had been engineered to keep those moments private. The system, church officials, corporate lawyers, private consultants, had allowed a tidy erasure. My mother's silence was not only personal, it was procedural. And then there was the night when Danielle wrote my name down in a ledger of grudges. I found out about it not through a public declaration, but through a whispered conversation between two women at the charity shop where I dropped off old linens. "You know the girl," one said. "Yes, the housekeeper. She keeps pictures." The other woman cut in. "Don't go poking. Not worth it. Married life gets messy when you start digging." When things are small and contained, they stay that way. When you begin to name them, they grow. We were naming. We had to be careful. The more we moved, filing subpoenas, asking for old hospital records, pointing to names in ledgers, the more we attracted attention. There were late-night calls with silence on the other end, cars that idled too long below my apartment, the feeling of being watched as if someone had lit a lantern on the porch of my life. Marcus suggested an intake of patience and the construction of a narrative that could hold up in court and in the press. He asked for restraint. He asked for bets to be hedged. "Patience is evidence," he would say. I learned the bureaucratic language of proof: chain of custody, admissible documents, authentication of signatures. I learned how to make a case without betraying the tenderness of the person at the center of it. My mother was not a file. She had been living flesh before she became a footnote. To make her a case was to make her human on paper. The middle weeks unfolded in a series of small, electric discoveries. An old church directory revealed that Amara had been on the list of volunteers the same year a donation appeared under a different name.
A hotel ledger showed a suite reserved under James's initials, in a period that matched one of the photographs. A receipt from a clinic gave us dates that would place a child in my mother's arms on a certain calendar, dates that lined up with my birth. Yet facts do not dissolve emotional armor. Danielle's campaign of erasure moved from private slaps to public insinuations. She insinuated that I was a gold digger, a liar, a woman who sought to unsettle a family for attention. She made her case with a social media post that pretended to lament and questioned loyalties in a voice that sounded like concern. She did not understand that my fight was not for wealth. My fight was to be named, to be allowed to exist fully in the vocabulary of their house, to have a seat at a table without an invitation tucked into my mouth. And then, on a Tuesday that smelled like rain, Marcus found a line item in a ledger that made the room in my chest ache with possibility. There was a deposit, months after an event, to a name that matched my mother's. The deposit was small, but the paper trail was a thing that could be followed. A consultant named Grant Mitchell had been paid to archive and remove. His signature was a small, crooked flourish. A man like Grant did favors to keep reputations neat. When we called Grant, the line clicked. He claimed to have no recollection of the specifics, a kind of procedural amnesia polished with the practiced tone of someone who had been paid for forgetting. He was not above being polite. He was not above being evasive. "Some things are better handled quietly," he said, as if reciting a philosophy. Something inside me said that was true. The thing that kept me small had always been silence. The thing that could free me might be shattering the silence into a noise loud enough to be heard by people who needed to be inconvenienced. As we started to stitch together a case, receipts, letters, photographs, we also prepared for the social cost. James had to be willing to be named as part of it. He would have to walk into rooms and say things that might cost his standing. Danielle would have to be confronted publicly with evidence she had performed hatred into a certainty. When James finally took my hand in a public place, and in a voice that trembled but did not break, said, "Ella is my daughter," the reaction was a small, low sound that could have been a gasp. People in dining rooms paused. A woman in a sequin dress dropped a napkin. Danielle froze, her face a silence that looked like stone. That was the connective line the title promised. When the man who had once been only the lover named Maria raised his voice in a room and said my name, Danielle stopped being just an angry employer and became, for all intents and purposes, my mother-in-law, the person in the family who would judge me, protect what she thought was hers, and make a life small in the name of preserving order.
Her hatred was no longer a private vice, it was a public posture. Yet even as he spoke, I could see the moment in which the revelation reached Danielle. It landed in her like a word that had been translated badly. Her face went from anger to something else, confusion, then the look of someone hearing a scandalous rumor and realizing the rumor might be fact. She took a step back, as if someone had pushed her. The social machinery began to hum. People chose sides. Cameras flashed in the distance. And the truth, finally allowed to breathe, did not make everyone grateful. It made some of them furious. It made others start to count loyalties. The house folded into a different geometry after that. Some doors that had once been closed opened, but not all of them in the same direction. I felt the weight of eyes that had never looked at me before. I felt the axis of my life pivot in a way that made me dizzy. We had more to do, legal filings to pursue, witnesses to coax into memory, records to subpoena. We had to navigate a system that had been built to keep things neat for people who liked neatness. We had to find allies in places where allies are often hidden, assistants who kept receipts, drivers who watched for envelopes thrown away, priests who remembered faces. There were dark things, too. A man who had once used his position to intimidate my mother called my phone from a number that flashed no name. Jacob's voice was a rasp, a promise that the past could bite back. "Don't dig," he said. "Some things don't want light." He made it sound like a favor. I did not know then how much danger we were stepping into. I only knew that I had a key, a photograph, and a name. I had a man who had finally said daughter in a public place. I had Marcus with his notebook and patience. I had a letter that kept saying, in its folded way, that my mother had chosen silence to survive, and that the past was not done with us. We arranged to bring the contents of locker 237 into the light of a lawyer's office, to scan and copy and secure. We made a plan to send a DNA kit to a lab with a reputation for discretion. We prepared to tell a truth that would ripple through rooms of power and privilege. On the day we drove the boxes away, Danielle watched us from a bay window, as if the scene were a play arranged for her. She did not come down to speak. Her lips were a thin line. Her arms were folded, as if to protect something invisible. For a moment I thought she might cry. Then she turned and walked away, the way someone does when their script ends. But hatred does not end with a look. It grows teeth. We had taken the first steps. We had opened a door with a key my mother had hidden for reasons that made more sense now than the day she wrote them. We had begun to name a life that had been intentionally split, to argue on paper and in person that my mother should be seen for the whole of who she was. There is a peculiar silence that follows action, not the hush of peace, but the taut smell just before thunder. We packed the boxes into James's car, like bones being moved to a new place. We did not know whether what would come next would be justice or simply a more public grief. When we left the parking lot, I glanced at James. He had an expression I had never seen on his face before, a mixture of shame and a strange relief, as if the man he had been stolen from him and replaced by someone who had to pay for a life of avoidance. He squeezed my hand and said, "We'll do it right." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe my mother had not sewn me into an invisible seam for nothing. I wanted the ledger, the photograph, the key, and the letter to be enough to make a claim on a life that had not included me. I wanted the man who had called his lover Maria to stand up and take responsibility. What we could not foresee was the way public acknowledgement would sharpen people's edges. Danielle's face when she first realized she was being called into the story was only the beginning. There would be whispers in the press. There would be people who profited from silence who would not want their hands in the light. There would be small men in big offices who had been paid to orchestrate forgetfulness. And yet, there would also be people who, once asked, would remember. That is where we paused, on the edge of a plan that would summon both accusers and allies. We had evidence enough to start legal inquiries, enough to make a DA raise an eyebrow, to make a private investigator lean forward in his chair. We had a photograph and a letter and a key, and we had a name that matched a ledger. We had James willing, in some measure, to admit complicity. We did not yet have the DNA confirmation. We did not yet have court dates or verdicts. But there is a power in naming, and that night as I lay awake in my little apartment above the laundromat, I felt the world shift in a way it had not in years. The shift was not all mercy. It was not all triumph. It was the precise, dangerous moment where truth begins to gather a following. Outside, the rain began to fall, the kind of large, patient drops that wash city rims. I listened to it and thought of my mother folding her hands on the kitchen table, thinking herself invisible as she kept love and shame in separate rooms. I thought of Danielle watching from a bay window, calculating response. I thought of the key in my drawer, ticking like a heart. The next morning, there was a knock at my door, soft and official. Marcus stood there with an envelope from a lab. The results could be in. The air in the flowway felt like a held breath. We were about to step into the part of the story where silence met evidence, where gossip met documents, where a slap met a photograph, and the photograph met a name. I opened the envelope with hands that did not steady. The lab letter was typed in black, neutral, font. It used words like match and probability and inconclusive in the language of someone whose empathy had been taught in a statistics class. My chest ached with anticipation and terror. Before I read the words aloud, before any of it could be turned into a headline or an argument, James came over and wrapped his fingers around mine. The gesture felt like an apology and a vow. Danielle, somewhere across town, prepared her response in a language of cold indifference, and I, who had been ignored to the point of being a ghost, sat at my kitchen table and set the paper down, ready to discover whether a piece of science could rewrite decades. When I unfolded the sheet and skimmed for the word that would change a life, the letters leaned into each other like witnesses. The word that hit me was not loud. It was simple and absolute. And then the world waited for me to make of it what I would. My hands trembled before I could steady them. The lab report sat on the kitchen table like a foreign object, white and official and utterly ordinary. Marcus watched me from the doorway, his notebook closed for once. James stood behind him. the kind of terrible quiet he had learned to wear when guilt was becoming a public thing. I read the headline first: genetic analysis, parentage testing. Then there were numbers I didn't understand, and a sentence that read like a verdict in a language I had been taught to listen for all my life. Probable parentage, consistent with biological relationship. The world contracted into the space between those two words. Nothing in me did what I expected. There was no trumpet of triumph. There was instead a slow, old grief unfolding, like the feeling you get when you find something you thought was lost and realize what it cost to lose it. James reached for the paper as if to protect it from me. I pulled it closer instead. "It's her," I said, stupidly, as if the lad needed my permission to speak. Marcus nodded. "It's pretty clear. We can file with this." "Then we do it," James said, voice flat as a knife. "We make it official." There was a calculation in his eyes that made my stomach turn. It wasn't only about truth. It was about consequences. But standing there, in my tiny kitchen, that now felt like the center of an expanding map, I felt a strange calm. I had asked to be named. DNA was only a tool for a deeper request, that people stop pretending I didn't exist. We did not rush into the public eye that day. Marcus advised patience. Legal steps required care. Chain of custody, certified copies, consultations with an ADA who could vet charges and determine the path forward. James's lawyer moved like someone dusting off old furniture, making sure the signatures were right and the words would hold in a courtroom. Raina Cole was a different thing entirely, an assistant district attorney with a reputation for being unflashy and precise. She listened to our story without theatrics.
When I said Amara's name out loud in her office, the sound of it felt like pushing a door that had been latched for years. "We can pursue the people who tried to hide documents," Raina said, folding her fingers. "Evidence tampering, obstruction, conspiracy to conceal. If we can show a pattern, payments, correspondence, destroyed records, that points to deliberate suppression, there are charges to be made. We don't promise outcomes, we pursue facts." That was the promise I wanted. Not vengeance, not performance. Facts. The first legal move felt like pretending nothing had changed. Raina requested records, subpoenas hummed through offices, and Grant Mitchell surfaced in a way that confirmed the ledger. He denied everything at first, classic evasions dressed in smooth voice. But paper trails are stubborn things. Emails with subject lines like archive request and invoices with Grant's company name began to appear in folders James's assistant turned over. The more we dug, the clearer the pattern. Donations, hush money routed through shell accounts, a consultant hired to manage optics. Grant's lawyers sent a carefully worded denial. His assistant's memory smudged exactly when details became inconvenient. It felt sometimes like peeling paint. Each layer exposed a different hand that had put varnish over truth. Then there was Jacob. He was the one whose shadow had loomed largest in my childhood memories, the man who had been uncle and whose presence had made my mother flinch in ways I did not understand until later. Marcus found traces of Jacob in police reports I had never been allowed to see. Even when charges had been filed years before, they had been quietly negotiated, pled down, or buried in a way that made them private but not public. We were a small force against an elaborate system. But Raina did what prosecutors do. She put the pieces into a sequence a jury could follow. She read invoices into the record, payments to Grant Mitchell for archival services, memos recommending that certain files be archived for sensitivity reasons, a note that suggested retrieving and securely removing patient files. We could hardly breathe during those depositions, but we kept breathing, because not breathing would have been the easy old habit of silence. News circulation began as a trickle. Someone in a press room peeked at a municipal docket and saw the names. A blogger picked up on the story because the wealthy man's name was attached to it. Rumors swirled and became a current. Danielle's team, predictably, pushed back into the familiar playbook. Statements about privacy, assertions that the family's reputation was being unfairly targeted, the insinuation that a working-class woman was trying to profit from a philanthropist's past kindness. The nastiness of it surprised me. People imagined wealth as a blamelessness. They think bank accounts erase responsibility.
But what they really guard is narrative, the tidy story that keeps things in the order they prefer. Our tiny stack of boxes from Locker 237 had the power to rearrange those narratives. One night, as the case began to thicken, there was a man outside my apartment building. He was too close to the door for comfort, leaning like he had a right to the stoop. I called Marcus. He arrived 5 minutes later, impatience like a protective flare in his face. The man left when he realized we had noticed, but that moment taught me something. Truth draws attention, and attention can be hostile. Then a voicemail arrived on my phone with static at the edges, in Jacob's voice low and rasping, the same tone he'd used years ago. You don't want to dig. Some things you should leave alone. It was a threat rehearsed into a habit. We did not leave things alone. Raina subpoenaed hospital records and the church logs. Roland, the driver who loved to sit in the corner and listen, found a series of receipts tucked inside a car seat and handed them over with the muttered apology of someone who had been waiting for permission to speak. George, the assistant who had once feared losing his job for telling truth, handed over a folder he had hidden under false bottom in his desk, guest lists, envelopes, in an old hotel folio with the same dates we were trying to match. A small trail of breadcrumbs became a road. As evidence consolidated, so did the pressure. The social elite shifted like tectonic plates. Invitations were canceled. Whispered phone calls occurred over clinking glasses, and Danielle's friends wrote her notes of support that looked like armor. She began to appear in public more often, a polished image of the woman who was owed things in life. Hatred, after all, is a performance that fits neatly into social scripts. If you practice the posture long enough, it becomes your costume. But the legal system also has rituals of its own. Grant was indicted on counts related to tampering and destroying corporate records. Jacob, it turned out, had been involved in separate criminal conduct that could no longer hide under other people's money. He was arrested one gray morning outside a bar and processed in a way that made his embarrassment public. The headlines were awkward, as headlines often are, messy, incomplete, and hungry for the next development. The real crucible came when Raina asked me to testify. She knew what the press conference would do, the way a single voice made an event of a life. You don't have to be heroic, she told me. You have to be honest. Testifying meant revisiting rooms of the past. It meant speaking of my mother in a way that stopped her being only an absence. I rehearsed the letter in my head, Amara's handwriting, the small key taped to the page. I thought of the yellow dress in the locker, the child's shoe with Amara stitched into the tongue. Those objects were not just proof. They were my mother's tenderness made legible.
The press conference happened in an afternoon where the sun seemed to be watching with mild curiosity. James stood at the podium with Raina at his side. Danielle did not come. I thought of the slap, of pearls, of the way she had turned my existence into a spectacle. My stomach clenched, but the sound of the crowd did not scare me the way it might have before. The lab result had been a black and white hinge, but the hinge had opened onto a room full of people with different motivations. Some wanted justice, some wanted scandal, some wanted to be seen as righteous. James spoke first in a voice that tried to keep shame inside its ribs. For many years, he said, I didn't know. I didn't look. That's my failure. We will cooperate fully with the investigation. He said more, words that unspooled responsibility in public, words that made Danielle's absence into a statement of her own. When I took the podium after Raina introduced me, something loosened. I read the essential things, my name, my mother's letter, the existence of the key, the items from Locker 237. I did not indulge in melodrama. I did not call names beyond what we could prove. I read the lines my mother had left, and spoke as if saying them aloud might make her more present. The backlash came in waves. Conservative readers called us opportunists. Some in the press misread my aim and painted me as a vengeful woman. Online, people argued about what loyalty looks like. But there were also people who sent messages of gratitude. Women who said they had been kept small for decades. Men who said they had never known how silence was used. Those messages mattered. They were the small repairs. Courtroom days are marked by specific smells, cheap coffee, paper, and the metallic scent of possibility. The trial that followed wasn't about the love between James and Amara. It was about the deliberate erasure of documents and the intimidation of witnesses who might speak. Grant's defense tried to reduce everything to bureaucratic error. Jacob's lawyer pretended there had been a misunderstanding.
The people who'd built walls around the truth tried to argue that what they did was normal. Raina was unyielding. In cross-examination, she had the kind of patience that is, when fully assembled, a moral force. She called witnesses who had seen envelopes tucked away, assistants who had been asked to shred or mislabel files, and accountants who testified about wire transfers that had been routed through shell companies. She called Roland, who had the public courage to produce the hotel folio, mismatched and faint, but legible enough. She called my mother's old landlady, who testified with a trembling voice about seeing Amara at odd hours, loving someone in ways that had not been allowed names. James took the stand. Watching him testify was like watching a man unthread himself. He admitted to the relationship with Amara in the way people admit to sins they wish they'd been earlier atoning for.
He described the glamour and the separate home life, the rules that made secrets feel necessary. He did not sugar it. He was uncomfortable and real. When Danielle's lawyer tried to paint him as an opportunist, Raina's questions recentered the narrative on the harm done to women whose lives were minimized. I testified about the letter and the key and locker 237. I did not go into the things Jacob had done in private. The script of maintaining dignity forbids that kind of spectacle. I testified about evidence, the shoe, the letters, the receipts, the ledger entries. I answered questions about my mother's choices with the kind of compassion shaped by living in her shadow. I did not scream. I spoke steady because I was telling a truth that deserved to be recorded, not shouted. The courtroom was a place of small legal wonders, the authentication of a photograph, a simplified ledger, an expert who said plainly that the document had been altered. Grant's defense collapsed in parts where the paper trail could not be explained by poor record-keeping. Jacob's dangerous behavior, once only an ominous rumor, was corroborated by witnesses who had finally been given permission to speak. On the day the jury returned, everyone in the gallery held their breath. A verdict is not a magic, it is a civic resolution. When the foreperson read the words, "Guilty on counts related to tampering and obstruction," there was a sense of a ledger being balanced, not with vindictiveness, but with the slow justice of process. Jacob's separate proceedings resulted in charges that were not lightened by social influence. The public record finally matched the private recollection. Danielle did come to the courthouse for parts of the trial. She sat stiffly in a pew like someone who had been asked to watch birds. I watched her sometimes from the witness stand. I watched the angle of her jaw, the way her hands kept fidgeting with the edge of her glove. Hatred leaves traces that are easy to see when you look up close. It is a shape someone practices until it becomes their face. There was a moment during closing arguments when Raina said what felt like the elemental thing I had been trying to say for years, that silence is not neutrality when it is bought, and when it is engineered to protect the powerful. She spoke about how my mother's life had been split between a public identity that could be owned and a private one that had to be hidden. She argued that when systems choose order over justice, they participate in harm. The verdict didn't put my mother back together. It didn't make up for the years she lived in rooms with different names attached to her, but it made the erasure visible and punished the hands that had tried to tidy it away. After the trial, people wanted comment. Some wanted show. I wanted quiet. We held a small memorial for Amara in a church that had once listed her among its volunteers. We placed the yellow dress in a frame. We read the letter aloud. People wept.
The ceremony wasn't a celebration. It was a small act of recognition. Danielle watched from a distance. When the memorial ended, she approached me like someone moving through formalities. I had imagined a confrontation, pearls broken, speech rehearsed. Instead, her face read like a book. Shape her animosity the way she had. She blinked, as if the question were a stinger, and then opened her mouth. A single breath left her, and that was all. The revelation had left her speechless in the courthouse when the exhibits were read, and when the jury found the charges proven. Here, in the stillness after people had prayed and sung, she had no answer that fit inside the language of the living. Later, when we were alone in a room that smelled faintly of dust and flowers, she finally spoke. Her voice was thin and not unkind. "Because I felt threatened," she said. "Because my life is arranged, and it felt like something was trying to undo that arrangement. I didn't know how to be anything but furious." It was an admission as stark as any confession. It wasn't an apology. It was the kind of truth that sounds almost like explanation.
the brittle kind that has no room for compassion. I thought of the pearls that had snapped off in the foyer, the famous hand that had struck me. Hatred is often a function of fear of loss, of irrelevance, of shame. Danielle's life had been built on a certainty that my existence threatened. Did you ever wonder why she might have kept secrets? She looked at me, as if surprised by that possibility. I thought she deserved what she got, she said finally. I thought she chose it. She didn't choose shame, I said. She tried to survive. Her face shifted. For the first time, there was the hint of something like comprehension. But comprehension is not atonement. Some doors, once opened, require more than a look. After the verdicts, the legal system did what the legal system does. It filed papers and moved them through channels. Fines were levied. Security reforms were suggested. The media moved on in its fickle way. But some things held. The boxes from Locker 237 were donated to an archive that promised preservation and access. The documents were scanned and given identifiers. They ceased being secret and became a public record. James came back into my life in a different shape. He was not a hero. He was messy and shame-ridden and trying in a way that made me angrier and more forgiving all at once. When he and I sat down to talk openly, there was a necessary honesty about what it would take for him to be part of my life now.
He had to accept the consequences of being named. That included ceding certain comforts and facing the people his reputation had insulated. We made plans together, a small foundation in my mother's name. We called it the Amara Initiative, a blunt and honest title. Its purpose was simple: legal aid, shelter, help navigating systems that prefer neatness over justice. The foundation was awkward at first. Donors who feared connection, bureaucrats who wanted forms. Creating something that makes support tangible requires the same stubbornness that had put us in court. At home, the house where pearls clicked and gossip was currency, things shifted faster and slower. Danielle did not attend many of the early meetings about the foundation. When she did, she sat at a distance and listened like someone attending an event at which they are expected to be stoic. The day we launched the Amara Initiative, I read my mother's letter again. The audience was both intimate and large. Survivors, lawyers, volunteers, journalists. When I pressed the microphone close and read the line about the key, "If you find me gone, know that I did this to keep you," the room was quiet, as if everyone there held their own keys. There was an odd moment afterward when Danielle approached the podium. Cameras pivoted like wary animals. She stood there, hands folded, and for a second I expected a speech. Instead, she placed a small envelope on the table between us and left. We did not open it in public. Later, James told me quietly that inside was a photograph, a candid one, in which Amara's face was not posed, but alive, smiling at something off camera. Danielle had written nothing. The picture was an offering, and perhaps an attempt at reconciliation. Reconciliation is not a single event. It is a slow making. People who have performed hatred often must unlearn practices and realize the suffering they reinforced. Some do. Some never will. I had wanted at the start of all this to be named, not to orchestrate the moral undoing of someone else. Wanting to be acknowledged and forcing acknowledgement are different things. The law could get us so far. The rest is lived. The final scene that made the title literal happened not in a courtroom, but in a small room with afternoon light and a cup of tea gone cold. Danielle stood there, no gloves, no jewels, and looked at me. I was not her enemy. I was the daughter of the woman whose face had been split into Maria and Amara. When James had said daughter in public, Danielle's world had tilted. Her hatred was an old reflex to preserve status by invalidating others. She did not apologize for everything. She spoke in a way that made it clear she had been unmoored by the revelation we had exposed. "I don't know how to be the person I have to be," she said. "Everything I thought I had was built on a story that isn't true." I could have listed the ways she had made me small. The withheld raises, the rumors, the doors closed. I could have pointed to the nights I took the long way home to avoid running into her, or the way the staff had watched us all like a small, terrified chorus. But speeches are not what I wanted from her. I wanted recognition, not performative, but real. She stopped again, her face folded, the hatred that had been so precise and practiced unspooled into something raw and wordless.
For the first time in years, she was speechless in a way that had nothing to do with control. The revelation, the photograph, the letter, the key, the DNA, the public acceptances, and the legal consequences had done what it needed to do. It had opened a space where she couldn't use her usual sentences to avoid feeling. "You hurt people," I said finally. Not a heroic indictment, only a fact. "You hurt my mother. You hurt me." Her lips quivered. There was no dramatic collapse, no cinematic confession. She reached for a hand that hovered between us. I did not take it. There are gestures that demand a history of repair before a touch can be returned. She understood that in a way her earlier fury had not allowed. The revelation left her speechless because it turned a story that had been sold as stability into something else, into accountability. It dismantled the idea that one's social arrangements are immune to truth. It left her with the cost of having allowed an injustice to persist. For some people, speechlessness is the first honest response to being faced with evidence of complicity. After everything, life became quieter, less showy. The Amara Initiative began to do the work we had promised. Legal clinics, a fund for women who needed to retrieve records, counseling. It was small at first, then grew like the slow, steady root system of something that had been planted in grief. I learned to live with James as an imperfect ally who was still learning how to listen. We had conversations where ugly things were aired and then made into plans. How to use money responsibly, how to be public without exploiting pain, how to acknowledge wrongs without performing them. He attended meetings sometimes. Other times he withdrew in ways I understood and forgave. Our relationship was a negotiation of boundaries and responsibilities, not the romantic, clean slate people sometimes imagine when a truth is revealed, but an ongoing, sometimes ugly process of making amends. Danielle's life recalibrated in ways neither of us could entirely predict. She was publicly chastened in the way her friends saw fit to chastise her, with polite distance and notes about growth. Privately, she attempted small reparations, donations to the foundation, a letter to my mother's archive expressing regret. I kept those things in a file meant for the future, gestures that might one day be the beginnings of a different story. There were nights when I still woke from the old habit of shrinking. Habits are stubborn.
The knowledge that the world had been rearranged to include me did not immediately make me comfortable with being seen. But slowly, people who had once ignored me began to nod in recognition, a small but steady affirmation. Years later, when the foundation sponsored a symposium on institutional silence, I spoke about names and how naming matters. I told the room about the key taped to a letter, about a shoe with a name stitched into its tongue, about the bland bureaucracy that had been used to tidy away a woman's life. I did not speak to shame. I spoke to a hard public compassion that insisted survivors are not props, but people with agency. At the end of the event, I walked past a table where photographs from the locker had been displayed under glass. One caught my eye, a candid shot of Amara laughing, hair loose, mid-gesture. Danielle stood near the exit, watching people leave. For a long second, our eyes met. There was no outburst. There was a look that carried an entire era's worth of things unsaid. Then she turned and left without a word. That was why she had hated me, because I was the living evidence of what she feared, that the tidy narratives she relied on could be rearranged by truth. The revelation left her speechless because it stripped away the language she used to justify preserving herself at the expense of others. It gave her no map for how to be otherwise, only the raw requirement of living with what she had allowed. My mother did not return to me, but the world she had been forced to live inside was vindicated in a way that mattered. People who had been complicit found themselves in hearings and depositions. Institutions pledged reforms. The foundation opened a small shelter named for Amara. The sign was made of plain wood and hammered by a volunteer who said it felt like building something that couldn't be erased. I visited the shelter often. The children who arrived there learned to speak their names again. When people ask why I stayed in a life that became so entangled with James's, why I didn't simply walk away after the first public hit, I say this. Naming mattered more than comfortable distance. My mother had taught me, in the practical way she could, how to survive. I wanted her survival to matter in the ledger of history, not merely as a footnote in someone else's glamour. In the end, the title that once felt like a provocation, Why My Mother-in-Law Hated Me, became a small map of cause and effect. Danielle's hatred originated in fear and privilege.
The revelation that left her speechless did so because it made visible what had been carefully hidden. A life split into public and private, and the human cost of the tidy story. I do not say this to gloat. Being the center of such a story does not make you holier. It makes you responsible. I was responsible not only for my mother's memory, but for using the small tools at my disposal, a key, a letter, a lab report, to make an argument the world had to acknowledge.
If there is a final thing to say, it is this. Truth is not always dramatic. Often it is quiet and stubborn, and requires the bravery of ordinary people to hold it up. Names matter. Letters matter. The simple act of refusing to let a story be tidy is in itself a kind of courage. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and sharing it so more people who are living in the quiet corners of their lives might find a light. And if you or someone you know needs help, look up organizations that support survivors in legal aid initiatives. There are places ready to listen and act.